Card games as a hobby are pretty synonymous with autism, and admittedly, a lot of us are kinda autistic, myself included. I was diagnosed with autism when I was about 10 years old, and I've been playing card games obsessively since I was 12. What draws so many autistic people to card games? And what keeps us involved? So, before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of disclaimers. I'm not trying to make any conclusive or scientific claims. My aim with this video is to explore the lived experience of autistic individuals within TCGs. So for context, a little bit about me. I'm Jess, I'm a former Yu-Gi-Oh! European champion and content creator. I generally focus on all things TCG. I've also conducted interviews with other individuals within the TCG space, with a variety of backgrounds.
What's going on, guys? It's Simo, and we're here talking about something a little bit different than we normally would.
Hi, my name is Cyrus Davis, and I am the 2023 Pokemon TCG International Champion.
My name is Alex Gravely. I joined the judge program in about 2012 and been judging since then.
So I think a good place to start is how we all got into card games initially, because I noticed a lot of trends. For me, it started just over a decade ago now, when my family bought me a Noble Knights of the Round Table structure deck, and then tried to encourage me to go to a locals. They found a local store. So once I had the cards, I went to locals, and I wanted to win. And then I just got more and more hooked on card games from there. I think for a lot of us, the obsession with card games normally starts when we're young, at varying ages.
I have been playing card games since I want to say 4 years old. I was one of the people that was around playing Yu-Gi-Oh! At release. I'm one of those boomers that opened some, Legend of Blue Eyes packs and starter deck Yu-Gi, starter deck Kaiba, and I've been hooked ever since.
I've been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Since about 2008. So since I've been playing stuff like 12, 13 years old.
So I've been playing since I taught myself how to play when I was about 10, so 12 years now.
When talking about TCGs and autism, the first thing that comes to my mind is socializing. Card games are inherently very social games. You have to play with other people, and often you have to play with complete strangers to get the most out of the hobby. It's no secret that autistic people generally struggle to make friends, especially when we're young and don't really know where to start. This has always been a big problem for me personally. I was never really able to make friends in school, so my entire social life was based in card games. Having that common interest in Yu-Gi-Oh! Allowed me to make some of my first friends. Once again, I'm not the only one.
I was always one of the, the weird smart kids that they put into the higher education programs with the other weird smart kids, because they didn't know what else to do with us because we were just sort of like in our own realm. I remember my mom also started a program here in town that was for the highly gifted kids. So basically all the kids who were like on the spectrum or had just learning disabilities or anything like that. And so it was funny because she organized meetups for all of these kids across the valley. And growing up, I remember it was like always difficult for me to make friends. But then at the same time, there was this game that I'm like, oh, this could be maybe a cool way to make friends because maybe they also play. But at the same time, I don't want to like talk about that because then you become ostracized like as being even more weird because it's like, oh, you're the weird kid that also plays, Yu-Gi-Oh, right? But through the special highly gifted programs that like my mom would found and there was others that she would find because she wanted to help me find other people to interact with because I was a bit of a loner in that regard. Then all of a sudden, all of the nerds would converge into one particular place to play Yu-Gi-Oh, to play Magic, and everyone's into the same stuff.
He does bring up an important point though. While Yu-Gi-Oh! Did present a social opportunity for him, it could also be used to outcast him even further. In my experience, autistic people tend to have slightly more unusual hobbies, and as Simo says, opening up about those hobbies can get kids further outcast or bullied more than they already are. This is pretty accurate to my own experience. I've been pretty open about competing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments from a young age. not having the understanding that it would make me stick out in a negative way, I was bullied relentlessly for it throughout high school. Something I would like to make clear here though, is that not every autistic individual has the same experiences. It is quite individual still. That being said, TCG communities are obviously a place that you can have that passion for TCGs and play the games without fear of being bullied. For a lot of kids like myself, these communities were a much easier place to socialize. But it doesn't mean that these communities themselves aren't their own frightening new world.
Yeah, I was definitely nervous when I first started going to locals. At first, it was very daunting, but over time, I definitely became a lot more, comfortable just as I got to know the people there.
It's an environment that takes time to get accustomed to, and frankly, can also be overwhelming. But as they become more accustomed, the community can become somewhat of a safe space.
You almost felt like you were part of you didn't feel like you were alone, right? It felt like there was other people who had shared similar experiences to you. It was really hard because you just felt so different compared to everyone else that was around you most of the time. And so that was a lot of fun.
A key thing that Simo touches on here is meeting those similar to you. And that doesn't just mean both liking a TCG. I don't just speak for myself or Simo here when I say that autistic people tend to be drawn to each other. We find it easier to slowly unmask and find our confidence when we're around people like us. Even when meeting complete strangers and playing against them, just knowing that there is that common ground makes it a lot easier to escape the anxiety of the situation.
Especially starting out, there's locals, and especially if you're going to locals and you don't know anyone, that can be rough, right? Because you're in this social environment with a bunch of people that you're not familiar with, but at the same time, they're all there to play the same game you are.
For myself, I've sat across from players from almost every continent while competing in TCGs. Sometimes it's tense when we're both competing for the win. Sometimes it's not. But there's always understanding that we're both there to play the game. This has been beneficial even outside of card games. Being forced to interact with and play a game with random strangers in a controlled environment translated into the real world for me. It made interacting with strangers outside of that environment that little bit more familiar and easier. In a similar vein, judging a TCG is just as demanding a social experience as playing. Maybe even more so with the added pressure of maintaining a professional appearance.
Definitely the difficult part of the social aspect. It is essentially masking for the entire weekend. You have this face of just complete customer service that you have to put on for the entire time. Because absolutely, more than just upholding the rules and the authority of the game is making sure that everybody that has spent their time and money to come out to the event has a good time. And with that is strong, good customer service.
So, for those who need it, we can define masking as changing your behavior in order to fit in. Previously in the interview, Alex talked about having a rigid moral system, and I think this factors into his drive to do his job as a judge to the highest standard possible. I think it's important to highlight this because despite the fact that he still finds himself masking, it still doesn't get in the way of his work. In this case, it's more of an assistive tool to help him through the weekend.
Done this for so long, I've sort of just gotten into my own routine of making sure that I am locked in. The things that would normally bother me in just like everyday society in terms of just like, oh my god, there's so many people out here. My body just sort of just like diminishes it for me because I know what I'm here to do and I sort of just push what I'm feeling aside to make sure that everything goes right.
That said, as with playing events, judging is a tiring activity. Having to put on for long periods of time won't help with that exhaustion.
How tight-knit the judge community is, I consider them a second family to me. So while it can be sort of exhausting on the actual like work part of it, it is, I don't want to say mini vacation, but it's like a family reunion.
Having that community behind him obviously means a lot to Alex. Just as TCG communities and testing groups can be a familiar and comfortable place for autistic players, the same can be said for judging communities within the TCG space. While discussing the social aspects of TCGs, I think a key thing to mention is how autistic people seem to find it much easier to interact if there's a reason or purpose other than socializing. Alex says that while judging, he's able to ignore things that would normally bother him. Simo mentions that it's much easier in Yu-Gi-Oh! To just go up to someone and ask them for a game. This isn't a pattern just limited to card games. While doing research for this video, we found a study by Germano Henning concluding that tabletop gaming can be used to help develop autistic people's social skills.
I definitely feel like Yu-Gi-Oh had an impact on helping me socially in a lot of ways, just because I was one of the kids growing up that always really struggled to understand like facial expressions and emotions and like how people are actually feeling. Being able to go to these, you know, more local tournaments or make new friends through like the gifted programs and things like that I was able to socialize in, I think really helped not only make me realize that one, there was other people that were like me out in the world, but then two, that this socializing thing isn't that difficult when you're with other people who are similar to you.
Despite the fact that the paper in question is more specific to role-playing games, TCGs still fall loosely into the tabletop category. Quite often you'll see gaming stores that both do tabletop and TCGs as one thing. For me personally, an example of how TCGs helped develop my social skills is body language. Reading body language was an important skill I had to learn to help tell if my opponent was bluffing or not. There was a point when I was younger that I made a list of different body languages and what they could mean. And Cyrus touches on this too.
I've always felt like it can be difficult to read people as someone who is autistic, but at the same time I feel like I've spent so much of my life developing that skill aggressively because in my day-to-day life, because I am like not naturally great at picking up social cues.
Now, despite the benefits of TCGs as a social opportunity for autistic people, it does have its disadvantages. The reality is that making friends and beginning those social exchanges is something that doesn't tend to come naturally to autistic people.
When I first started playing the game, especially, it was really difficult to make friends in my local scene. Even now, I feel like it's still difficult for me to like make friends with other players, even when I know that they want to, test with me, they want to talk about Pokemon with me. It's still difficult for me to like initiate those conversations.
Having this more comfortable environment where it's easier to socialize does make it easier, but in reality, it doesn't remove the difficulty. One particular source of trouble that I'd like to bring attention to is events. Loud, busy, cramped, warm, and just generally chaotic. On paper, large TCG events sound like an autistic person's worst nightmare.
Then you start scaling up to regional size events when you start getting to a few hundred people. And you're like, whoa, there's a lot of people crowding in this room. And there's a lot of sensory overload going on, right? Because there's just a lot of noise. There's a lot of chaos. As someone who, is autistic, it's like I very much like my structure to things. Then when you get to the YCS level events, when you've got thousands of people and it's just pure calamity, you got people shouting on the megaphones all the time because whether it's a new round starting or they're looking for certain people or what have you, there's just so many people, especially if there's no organization for seating at these larger events. It's like a complete traffic jam.
The reality is that it can be exhausting when you're having to manage a staggering environment, managing your games, and more. Personally, I can think of countless times where I've had to leave the venue or find a quiet space to just decompress a little bit.
At times, especially after a stressful game, have to put my headphones in and like avoid being in an area where I will be spotted by people who may come up and talk to me because I need that time to like de-stress.
I think it's fair to say that for some, after a tough game, it's helpful to go over to friends and discuss what happened and discuss the intricacies of the game. But for others, we need the times to pause, process what's just happened, and recharge, getting into a good mindset for the next round. Another area that both Simo and Cyrus brought up, the cramped playing areas.
We go and play a game for 40 minutes and you might be like crammed shoulder to shoulder with the person next to you because maybe the venue doesn't have like a large enough seating area, so you're kind of all squeezed in there. So that's uncomfortable, right? Because being autistic, like you kind of don't like being touched unless you like have to be, or you're like, giving permission for that.
At least in Pokemon, I know there's so many restrictions that like with like the venues that make things difficult. Like we're always so like seated close together, which can be like isn't like makes things more uncomfortable.
It's a bit of a stereotype that autistic people don't like touch. But I think most people can relate to how physically uncomfortable it is playing on overcrowded tables, shoulder to shoulder with random people. Even outside of autism, the reality is that some people will need more space than others, and not everyone is comfortable being crammed between a bunch of strangers. And to conclude the event struggles, travel. While travel isn't exactly social in the typical sense, it does involve being trapped in public spaces for extended periods of time. In most cases, you do have to interact with strangers, whether that's getting your passport checked, saying thank you to someone who holds the door, or just letting someone out of a train carriage. I think in all, the social aspects of TCGs aren't necessarily harder for autistic people, but they do look a lot different. Events are scary places, and often require aids like headphones to make them more manageable. But at the same time, these are experiences that autistic people do want to engage with, and do benefit from. For some of us, TCGs have even been an important tool in learning to navigate the world of socializing. For some of us, it was the first time that we met people similar to ourselves. Ultimately, I suppose the takeaway here is that despite how frightening TCGs can be, and how frightening interacting with TCGs can be, they do benefit the autistic people who are involved with them. And I think that's shown in the amount of autistic people who play card games. It's one thing to say that card games are beneficial on a social level, but hobbies have to actually be fun for people to want to engage with them. So what is it about TCGs that attracts autistic people?
Something that kept coming up with almost everyone that I spoke to was the puzzle-like elements of TCGs. Being that every time you build a new deck or play a game, you're always trying to figure out how to make the best deck for the situation, or make the best play for the situation, kinda like a puzzle. For me, it was those deck building challenges or puzzles that really got me hooked on Yu-Gi-Oh when I was young. Simo said, growing up, information retention was quite natural to him, and as a result, puzzles got kinda dull. Something that attracted him to Yu-Gi-Oh was the dynamic nature of the game, where card games are essentially an ever-changing puzzle.
As a kid, I always loved games and puzzles. For me, Yu-Gi-Oh sort of really just scratched the puzzle itch, because it felt like a puzzle that was never solved in a lot of ways. Every game state or board state scenario, even in old Yu-Gi-Oh, I know a lot of people can make fun of old Yu-Gi-Oh for being super simple, but as a younger kid, that was enough. It was always this dynamic environment where things were always changing. And I think that was just so stimulating and fired all the dopamine receptors, because it just kept going. Until one person lost, it was just a never-ending fluid puzzle.
And Alex too.
Was there anything that's specific that attracted you to card games?
Definitely the puzzle thing. I was absolutely the kid that would break apart everything to try and figure out how it worked and then put it back together, things like that.
From this, it makes a lot of sense that Alex would be attracted to a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Like Simo says, it's a dynamic game with no set answers. And on top of that, it's incredibly mechanically complex.
Cyrus didn't really touch on the puzzle element of card games as much, but she did touch upon my next point.
Pokemon is still what I do, especially Pokemon with like close friends, is still what I do to like de-stress. That is still what I want to do when I am like, even if I'm like super depressed and I'm at my lowest, and I barely want to leave my room. Like playing Pokemon with someone that I care about is like one of the things that like gets me. It's something that I can use to de-stress.
She mentions the comfortability aspects of playing Pokemon, the familiarity, the fact that she can go back to it whenever she needs. Autistic people are kinda known for their fondness of familiarity. Even with me. I quit competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Just under a year ago now. But I don't think I'll ever stop playing. It's just so comfortable and familiar to me. Now that we're talking about interest in TCGs, or dwindling interest, I want to go back to Simo. For those who don't know anything about him, he's a Yu-Gi-Oh YouTuber best known for retro formats. And he's been playing TCGs for longer than anyone else I talk to. So when you're dipping back into older formats, where the card pool doesn't necessarily change, surely there has to come a point where there aren't any more puzzles to solve. So what keeps him interested despite that?
COVID happened, since a lot of my stuff was so competitively geared, I had to sort of pivot my model because it wasn't sustainable, considering at that time, we didn't know when competitive Yu-Gi-Oh was going to return. So that I remember Gage and I spitballing ideas, and like that's how we came up with Progression Series as like a content concept.
For those of you who aren't familiar, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Progression Series is probably one of the most popular Yu-Gi-Oh! YouTube series ever. Dipping into Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout all of its eras, it's become a staple of the community, gaining hundreds of thousands of views per episode.
I really thought Progression Series was fun for a lot of reasons because one, so many people who entered Yu-Gi-Oh! Later didn't get to like experience what Yu-Gi-Oh! Was like when it was at its first inception like I did. And so I had to experience synchros or Xyz in their like native introduction into the game. So when we start getting to those elements in Prog and in history, that was really fun because I had never played with those cards in that card pool and I got to experience that power for the first time. So it was like, okay, simultaneously, I'm scratching 2 itches at the same time.
Card games are dynamic. Within one card game, there can be countless different formats to choose from. The most well-known example being Magic the Gathering's Commander format. It's an alternative format that has become arguably more popular than Best Standard. And Commander isn't Magic's only popular alternative format. You have Modern, Commander, Dan, Pioneer, just to name a few. This is the same for most card games that have been going for a while now. It's a way to keep the hobby fresh. As much as autistic people tend to hyper-focus on their hobbies, they're also pretty prone to burnout. And having alternative formats allows people to keep playing card games even when their normal way of playing starts to get a bit boring.
A lot of how much enjoyment you can get out of it is just how many times you can just like double dip into your own special interests with it and just make this entire like comfort area for you.
This idea of being able to dip into multiple of your hobbies at the same time came up repeatedly in my interviews. Whether it was combining card games with content creation, coaching, web development, or something else entirely. To put it simply, being able to combine multiple of your interests at the same time is fulfilling. Even on a much more simple level within TCGs, you can pretty much always combine your interests. From liking dinosaurs and playing a dinosaur deck, to playing a Pokemon that you beat the game with. A big draw of TCGs for me was, and still is, the rewarding feeling of being able to show off my skills that I've spent hours honing. When autistic people get deeply involved in their hobbies, they tend to go all in. And I think for some people, there is that necessity to show off and share what they're passionate about. Card games provide an opportunity to do that. Even as a kid, Simo says he enjoyed learning off better players and then sharing what he learned with his friends. Of course, there is an element of kids generally liking to show off to their friends, but I think he goes a bit deeper than that. This was kind of the same with me. My YouTube channel, the one you're watching right now, started because I got obsessed with a specific deck within Yu-Gi-Oh! And wanted to share more about it with the world. I think it also provides autistic people with much more tangible goals. Whether that's aiming to judge the most prestigious event, be the best source of information for your deck, or win a major tournament. Something to touch on, I think, is that among autistic people, the rate of unemployment is higher than among the general population. However strange it may sound, card games and similar hobbies can provide accessible employment. It's quite well known that neurodiversity and the standard systems of employment, education, and hiring don't always mix. I myself have struggled, especially within education, and found ways to get by largely thanks to card games. The point I'm trying to make here is activities within large communities, like card games or general gaming communities, often start as hobbies, but over time can become a form of often self-employment. Whether that's becoming a professional player full-time, vending, content creation, and more. Moving on now, I do want to take a moment to talk about a point that came up repeatedly.
Oh, imposter syndrome is 100% real, for sure. There are so many times I go to my wife or my friends and I'm telling them, like, what am I doing, man? Like, I'm just a guy. I just like Yu-Gi-Oh. I've got energy, but at the same time, I don't know. You could get like nihilistic about it, right? Where you're just like, I'm just like one person, and like, what does any of this matter? It's just a card game. Like, who cares? And so I imagine that's a shared feeling for a lot of people.
I think I honestly have felt less pressure to prove myself over time. I think that, like, to me, it's most important that I think I'm a good player. And that's something that I have struggled with a lot, is sort of almost like imposter syndrome about how good I am at the game. Because I have so many friends that are also, so great at the game. Um, and I can't help but compare myself to other players.
We can all acknowledge that imposter syndrome is something that most people will feel throughout different aspects of their life. But I thought it was worth mentioning, as it's something I can relate to too, especially within card games. For me, I could put these imposter syndrome feelings down to anxiety, which is commonly found alongside autism, or just that I find my own achievements within card games pretty surreal. But who knows? Everyone is different, and there isn't one blanket answer. Before wrapping up, now that we've talked about the different aspects of TCGs and their draws, I want to talk about accessibility. Everyone that I spoke to for this video had their own struggles at events, whether that was sensory overload or a variety of other things. And there are some things that could be put in place that could be used to help autistic people within TCGs. One I'm a big advocate for is a quiet room. Somewhere people can go when they get a bit too overwhelmed or just need the peace and quiet for a couple of minutes. It's something that would have been a godsend for me during my playing career.
Yeah, I think definitely having somewhere that you can go and unwind between events, that is where, people are expected to be, like, pretty quiet, would be good, especially just for if you need time to, like, not be, like, super social and just sort of process your last round.
It would be interesting if they had some sort of accommodation like a quiet room at these types of events. That could be interesting if it's within their ability to do so, because then that could help people in those types of situations, especially because our game and games similar could have a tendency to like just attract people that are similar to us in a lot of ways. I wouldn't complain. I'd be in there all the time.
While these facilities, to my knowledge, don't exist within either Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering, Cyrus does bring up that VIP areas are a thing in Pokemon, but I don't believe that these areas were designed for that purpose, nor should they be locked behind a paywall. The others that I spoke to did describe similar issues with events. One issue in particular was the cramped nature of event halls. I think larger, less cramped venues would benefit everyone, not just autistic people. While I'm aware there is a level of logistical challenge here, both with having increased venue space and with having a quiet area, putting more money into these event area preparations could go a long way in terms of accessibility. Konami, Wizards of the Coast, the Pokemon Company, these are multi-billion-dollar organizations that rely on the positive experience of their players to keep them coming back. We've seen positive change from these companies before in response to criticism, and it'd be nice to see it in this area too. Overall, I do think TCG events do a good job of catering to their players and making the space feel welcoming. However, I think these are just some of the small adaptations that could be made that would improve the TCG experience for the players and make it more accessible for autistic players. I guess it's time to conclude. As I said earlier, I'm not here to make any conclusive or scientific claims on autistic individuals within card games. On the surface, autistic players do face challenges when engaging with card games as hobbies. The socializing, the overwhelm, the community focus, to just name a few. But at the same time, TCGs are quite a unique hobby. They offer opportunities for autistic people to meet like-minded people and jump into social groups. It gives us opportunities to express ourselves with the cards we choose to collect and the strategies we choose to play. And it's different for everyone. Even though we fall under the same umbrella of TCG players, there are just so many unique and different ways to interact with these hobbies. For all of those reasons, and so many more that didn't come up in this video, TCG seems to check a lot of boxes for autistic people. From the nostalgia of childhood games to the dynamic puzzle elements. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for watching. This is a topic that I'm personally quite passionate about, and it's been nice to be able to research and put this piece together. A huge thank you to everyone who I interviewed. You all did amazing. Thank you so much to everyone who offered me advice while making this. All of the relevant links and all of the research papers we used in this will be down below in the description. For the first time in this video, remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.